Five former World Junior hockey players were found not guilty of sexual assault last Thursday, setting off a wave of reaction and drawing sharp criticism from defense lawyers over Hockey Canada's handling of the allegations. The verdict came after Superior Court Justice Maria Caricia spent over 5 hours reviewing the evidence before delivering her decision in a packed London, Ontario courtroom. Earlier, I sat down with Dan Robson, a senior writer for The Athletic, to discuss the verdict of the trial and the reaction that has followed. Dan, thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, there's been a lot of reaction across Canada and honestly around the world, some agreeing with the judge's decision and others saying that this is making it a lot more difficult for sexual assault survivors to feel comfortable coming forward. Does the amount of public interest in this case surprise you at all?
Oh, not at all. I think from the very beginning, when the allegations surfaced, we saw the almost degree of national crisis that emerged. And since that came out, I mean, it's been something that has come and gone from the headlines, but throughout the trial, you could just tell there was sort of an intensity, a real focus on what was happening. And given the position that hockey plays in Canadian culture, but also the topic itself is about how the justice system treats sexual assault claims and sort of views these rules and regulations and the laws around this. So I think it sort of hits all these different areas of extreme interest, and yeah, we saw that throughout.
And with the justice system, there is rising arguments of the fact that the court failed EM, who is what we referred to her during this case. Will this change how Canadian law views consent in sexual assault cases moving forward? A lot of the argument was, what is consent and where does Canadian law draw the line with consent? So has this opened the door for consent cases and what consent really means in these kind of instances?
It's going to be interesting to see what happens next. I mean, if there's going to be an appeal from the Crown, they have 30 days to do so, or about a month. So I think that will be the next question in that conversation. Obviously, there's a lot of debate happening in legal circles. I mean, some people believe that the judge got it right in this case, and that sort of nothing sort of was wrong with the way the case was presented and ruled. But obviously, advocates for sexual assault survivors are saying this is an indication that something that needs to change, something that's inherently wrong and flawed in the way that these cases are viewed needs to change. So I don't think this is the end for sure of this conversation. I think this is probably a important pivot point within that conversation, but where it goes, I'm not sure because there's some ingrained sides here, and this is a conversation that unfortunately is not an easy one to come to terms with, and I think we'll be debating and discussing for some time.
Well, following the verdict, the NHL said that the players are ineligible to return while under review. And shortly after that, the NHLPA responded and said that players should be able to return to work. How do you think that this is going to play out? And what do you make of the NHL's comments as well as the NHLPA?
I wasn't surprised by either. I think that the NHL is played it very cautiously here. They would have run that statement by their lawyers. I think in advance of the verdict, they would have really thought out what their response was going to be, knowing that the question would be asked almost immediately. I mean, there was speculation, throughout the trial even, but within early July when free agency opened up the NHL about sort of what might happen with a player like Carter Hart should he be acquitted, and those conversations kind of hit a nerve with a lot of people because obviously there was something much more important playing out in the Canadian justice system than where someone was going to sign next. But inevitably, given the NHLPA's a very firm statement against the NHL statement, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to make sure that these players are able to continue to pursue their careers. And in the end, I do think we're going to come to a point where the NHL allows them back in. I just think it's sort of a matter of time. They've said they're going to review the assessments of the judge's decision, and so I think once we get to that point, we'll see an opening for these players to return. The question will be at that point, what teams will decide to pursue them if they'll pursue them. I think there's going to be a calculus there in terms of the cost benefit of the public perception of signing a player who's gone through a trial like this and who was part of something who, whether criminal guilt was assessed or not, in this case it wasn't, it was still, as the NHL pointed out, these are very uh, very grim accusations and sort of the agreed statements of what happened that night are things that are be difficult for these players to put behind them. So it will be interesting to see what happens next in terms of the value a player might have to an organization versus the public pushback they might get. And I think that's going to be the conversation we'll be having in a couple of months.
Well, following the verdict, as I've mentioned, a lot of people disagreed with the judge's decision. How much backlash do you think the NHL could potentially face by allowing these players to return?
It could be significant, for sure, but at the same time, they'll receive backlash for not allowing them to return. So it's kind of a I don't feel bad for the NHL for being in that position. I mean, that's the reality of being a professional league and having to deal with the fact that society intersects with your sport. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And the NHL's had to grapple with a lot of issues that are very uncomfortable in the last decade, in particular. Racism, homophobia, and misogyny. And I think we're at a point now where um, there's a recognition that the NHL needs to be much better at being at the forefront of these issues and these conversations, even though it's stumbled so many times in these areas. So I do think that when one of these players is allowed back in the NHL, it's going to create some very negative headlines and a lot of criticism. Um, I- at the same time, I think there's going to be this reality that on the other side of it where if the NHLPA is going to put a ton of pressure on the NHL to allow them back in, and the players themselves will be doing this as well. So I don't know where the measure of those sort of conflicting pressures where the point meets in which one wins out.
Well, we've seen things like this happen in other leagues where players have been able to return despite things that they've done. I know the men were found innocent, but the argument online right now has been um, not guilty, but not innocent. So, with that, do you think the NHL will follow other leagues' standards that they've set and follow that, or will they set their own expectations for the players? If they're allowed to return, maybe there will be certain protocols moving forward that players will have to go through if they are found in cases like this.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, the judge made a statement in the case that I think is really important. That that the finding is not about morality here, but moral culpability is still a thing that matters. And we can say in the court of law you're not guilty, but in the court of everyone's opinion and in human decency, there's a real issue here, and those are completely separate things. Um, I think the NHL will look around to different leagues at their policies. I know I think the NHL lacks policies in this area in particular, and they've been criticized for that. So I don't know if maybe we'll get to a point where they start to formulate a more specific policy. Absolutely, I can see things like training and sort of mandatory uh, conditions set on a return for a player, something like that. I don't know if that's all just sort of lip service to the actual issue, but there will certainly, I think, be sort of opportunities to set up ways to sort of show that they've done the work and they're trying to make sure that they're addressing these issues. But yeah, in the outcome, I'm not entirely sure. We do hope. I think if you're just anybody who cares about the game and has been following along with this in particular, this story in particular, but also previous stories in the past, you do hope that for whatever reason, whatever the impetus for the reason is, that there is some sort of significant change that comes. So whether it's if it's a PR sort of a statement of saying, we need to make sure we're looked like to be doing the right things, or whether there's sincere change that happens. I just hope the outcome of that is some sort of change for, maybe not necessarily just players in the NHL right now, but junior players coming up and the next generation of players that rise in Canadian hockey, that we don't have another situation like this.